Good day, fellow educators and researchers. I'm Ching from Singapore. I work with education departments and public schools in China to train teachers, to set up and run school departments, and facilitate international collaborations. I'm a researcher with a Malaysian university, and it's in this capacity that I'm presenting this study. My background is in education and psychology, and for this session, I'll be talking about how the choice of familiar versus unfamiliar teachers for online instruction might matter, especially during extraordinary times like the pandemic. Okay, at the height of the COVID outbreak in Wuhan City in January 2020, China started locking down most other cities around the country. This is in a desperate attempt to curb the spread of the virus. This was just before the 3 weeks winter holidays. So it was a very quiet and very uneasy Chinese New Year for China at that time. As we know, schools did not reopen in February, and the lockdown continued for about 12 more weeks for a total of about 15 to 16 weeks or so. However, at that point of time, nobody knew how long the lockdown would last. So to minimize disruptions to the students' learning, most, if not all the schools, scrambled to move their lessons online amidst this perpetual school closures. And so in Anhui province, China, which is the location of this particular study, most public schools implemented their online lessons in a very hasty manner using the broadcasting method, where students were given a timetable to watch live streamed or pre-recorded lessons on TV or on social media apps such as DingTalk. No matter what the mode of delivery was, whether it was by TV or social media app, whether it was live streamed or pre-recorded, there were minimal interactions between the teachers and the students. And very importantly, the lessons were sometimes delivered by strangers, delivered by teachers who were unfamiliar to the students. So as such, the students only got to see their own teachers some of the times. So this arrangement carried on for another 12 weeks after the winter holidays until the schools reopened in May. For this study, so far with regard to COVID lockdowns, there are many studies on online teaching strategies, what schools and teachers should do. There are studies on the negative impact on mental health, depression, isolation, and all that. There are studies on the impact on social relationships. And of course, there are also studies on the widening of the social class gaps from the economic side. So we have studies from the pedagogical point of view and the psychological point of view, and of course the sociological point of view. Now, what about the choice of online instructors? Do they matter? Regardless of the instructional approach, there has to be an instructor, an online teacher. So does it matter who this person is? What about the impact of the choice of the instructor? Now, as mentioned in the context of this study, the online instructors are sometimes complete strangers. However, there is a lack of studies on whether this familiarity of the teachers made a difference or not. And therefore, the objective of this study is to find out if the familiarity of the online teachers made a difference on the students' receptivity of the online lessons, as well as on their mental well-being during the initial COVID lockdowns in China. This is a retrospective study, and existing data that were collected for other purposes were analyzed. Now, this retrospective study is set in the context of online learning during the COVID lockdowns in China, and how the familiarity of the teachers might have an effect on how the students perceive the lessons, and how, whether it affects their mental health or not. Now, let's look at some of the related concepts. First, on the concept of familiarity. You'd be familiar with the saying that familiarity breeds fondness, meaning that the more familiar you are with someone or something, the more you would like it. In this study, it would be familiar teachers. So from the pedagogical point of view, we could always explain that good teacher-student relationships evoke more positive feelings in students. Or you could do it from the psychological point of view. We could use the familiarity principle to explain the phenomenon, where the more a person is exposed to someone or something, the preference for that person or thing would increase. Okay, the next is the effect of online communication. Pre-COVID, before COVID, pre-COVID studies have shown that regular online communication is associated with lower levels of loneliness, especially among old people. And what about during COVID? Well, during COVID, regular online communication is associated with lower depressive symptoms. Note that this online communication that we're talking about here is irrespective of whether the interactions were with familiar or unfamiliar people. So regardless of whether they are familiar people or strangers. Okay. So the third concept, the third related concept is the closest to this particular study. In a study conducted in Japan, it was found that reduced online interactions with familiar people during the COVID lockdown in Japan was associated with increase in depressive symptoms, increase in feelings of loneliness, and increase in social isolation. So these are quite self-explanatory. You can't go out during a lockdown. You can't have face-to-face interactions. You can't meet your friends. You miss outdoor activities and all that. You miss social activities and all that. And if on top of this, you still don't communicate with people online, in this case, familiar people, you tend to get more depressive symptoms and loneliness. So now we have an actual study to support this assumption, this postulation. However, I have to emphasize that for this Japanese study, the lockdown was a lot lower in terms of restrictions and durations. This was only about 5 weeks and very mild. While in China, the lockdowns were a lot more worse. It's ground zero. It happened in China, and the restrictions were a lot more punishing. So now we know that, number one, we tend to like familiar people more. Okay, number two, that online communication, interaction itself, whether with familiar people or strangers, helps to reduce negative feelings like loneliness and depressive symptoms. And that reduced online interactions with familiar people during a lockdown is associated with various negative feelings, emotions, and experiences. So what are we trying to do here? So from here, we're trying to establish that the choice of familiar teachers matter, and that by interacting with familiar teachers or just looking at them, merely seeing familiar people during COVID lockdowns might actually affect the students' receptivity of the online lessons, and also more or less affect their mental health, mental well-being during the initial COVID lockdown in China. Now, research methodology. Let's have a look at the methodology. First, the background. We know that the online learning in China started after the winter holidays, because at that point of time, nobody knew when they could open up again. So they had to solve this schooling problem. So they replaced it with online learning. And that the schools subsequently reopened in May 2020, after about 15 to 16 weeks of lockdown, and after 12 weeks of online learning. And so immediately after that, after they reopened, went back to school, some of the schools wanted to find out how the students were feeling and how well they reacted to the online learning arrangements. So what did they do? They conducted a very quick survey to find out. So the respondents in this study were high school students from 2 public Chinese high schools in Anhui province, China. Again, we have to bear in mind that this is a retrospective study using existing data that were collected for other purposes, the purposes above, and not for this particular study. What about the instruments? The instrument used was a questionnaire that consisted of 19 questions that were divided into 3 sections. For this study, the responses for 5 questions were selected for analysis. Now let's look at the analysis and results. So based on a very superficial look at the data, the diagrams here, you can see that the respondents tend to prefer familiar teachers more than unfamiliar teachers. Yep. So you can see there's more green on the right-hand side, while the red color is more towards the middle, more neutral. And for the second diagram, looking forward to seeing people, they also tend to look forward to seeing familiar teachers as compared to unfamiliar teachers. Again, this is quite similar to the first diagram. Now, but we know that these superficial understanding is not enough. So what about statistical analysis? Well, I did a normality test, and the data are not normal. So a non-parametric test was conducted to compare the responses. The results show that the general preference for familiar teachers, which is a composite score of questions 1 and 5, is significantly higher than the general preference for unfamiliar teachers, strangers, which is a composite score of questions 2 and 6. The effect size was quite large. Next, another question, question 10, was analyzed, and we can see that most respondents agree that the online lessons helped to alleviate some of the negative feelings associated with the COVID lockdown. And what is important is that on further analysis, we did a correlational analysis. It was found that this correlated strongly with the preference for familiar teachers, but quite weakly for strangers. So what do the results suggest? Well, the findings suggest that during the initial COVID lockdowns in China, when things are very bad, and they had to take online lessons at home, the students overwhelmingly preferred seeing familiar teachers, their own teachers, as compared to strangers. And that the preference for familiar teachers and the perception that the online lessons help to alleviate negative lockdown feelings was strongly correlated, which kind of imply that seeing familiar teachers online could have contributed to reducing some of the negative feelings that they experienced during the lockdown. So the students could be happy to see their teachers for whatever reasons. Maybe it's the existing strong teacher-student relationship. Maybe it's just pure familiarity. Like you see someone on TV, oh hey, it's my teacher. Maybe it's because of that. Maybe seeing their teachers help to evoke certain feelings that make them feel that they are in the classroom again, or maybe it just feels funny to see that teacher who otherwise look very strict in class normally. It's just funny to see them fumble around with the technology and the recordings. So no matter what the reasons are, the important thing is that familiarity made a difference. This is especially during exceptional times like this, during a pandemic or other large-scale natural disasters or large-scale events where people are under duress or forcefully isolated. So the role of the teacher during these times, the role goes beyond delivering lessons online. You're not merely teaching. You're not merely compensating for the lost school time. So for administrators, the choice of familiar teachers and teachers who have already developed a bond with their students might make a difference on the students' mental health. Even if it's only an online presence, this online presence could be important. This might not be a solution, but it could have played a part in alleviating some negative feelings, or at least, for the loneliness part. So when it comes to choosing between available off-the-shelf online learning solutions, or getting our teachers to deliver the online lessons, I think educators should also take into account the emotional needs of the students, of the learners, from the psychosocial perspective. This would add a little personal touch. Now, this personal touch might just make a little, but very significant difference. In this case, the helping hand might just go beyond the computer screen. So with this, I've come to the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening. And if you have any questions, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you.